Never Let You Go. By Golden Paul. It began, as most sad stories do, with a funeral. The gray day over Canterlot Cemetery was heavy with planned rainfall, and made a suitable backdrop to the sad scene. A host of ponies stood by the freshly dug grave. Elderly mares cried into the shoulders of stallions, and many foals cried along with their parents. A coffin was being slowly lowered into the soggy earth. The wet mud around the edge of the hole bled its water. The pair of solemn-looking stallions in black attire took the strain on the cords bearing the simple carved frame into its final resting place. As the wooden box vanished from view, the pony presiding spoke a few words of comfort. They were heartfelt and well-meaning, but failed to soothe the ache of loss felt by those present. Dashing Daisy was a friendly and well-loved filly in the local community. She had not been considered among the social elite of Canterlot, never seen attending the formal parties or high-class events. Daisy had nevertheless been well known as a pony who would quietly work away, helping others around her. She had been young, full of life, and happy, but it seemed the world sometimes makes harsh choices in who gets rewarded for their good deeds and who misses out. Sadly, it was her helping nature that led to Daisy's demise. It was believed that her frequent trips to visit the ill and afflicted was how she caught the lung disease that finally claimed her life. It was tragic, not understood, and seemed totally unfair. For a pony that had no rank or prestige, it was a final mark of respect that so many had come to her farewell. All in all, it should have been a final recognition of a life well lived, and then the ponies all about should have gone back to their lives, spurred on by the great example of a life well lived, even if shorter than it should have been. But that was not the end of it. Only a few short days later, the first thefts began. The modest home of Dashing Daisy was broken into. The place was ransacked, and a number of personal items were taken before the family had gotten a proper chance to sort through her belongings. Soon after that, small gifts she had given to friends and family were also stolen from their rightful places. Pony shook their heads at such despicable acts, pouring salt into an already painful wound and drawing out the loss the family already felt. The outrage was piqued when the grave site was looted and the coffin along with the body of Dashing Daisy was taken. Such a vile act was a massive step too far in every pony's mind, and the perpetrator promptly rose to Canterlot's most wanted criminal. It was a shocking state of affairs for the city, where serious crime was almost unheard of. The thief had covered their tracks well, though, and despite a spirited effort by local law enforcement, the pony or ponies responsible for the crime evaded capture. Long hours were committed to solving the crimes, but the theft seemed to end with the loss of Daisy's body. Crimes of this type were mercifully uncommon in Equestria, but that also meant the experience in solving such were sorely lacking. This was not to say that the Guard were unable, far from it, and after a tense few weeks the pursuing lines of investigation led the City Guard to a most disturbing find. All these events led to Lieutenant Steel Resolve and Sergeant Night Blade finding themselves before an imposing crypt belonging to the well-respected family of Conservation. This family were respected for their love of history and of preserving important sites across Equestria. The stone edifice loomed, over the two guards, its angled features covered with moss and creeping vines. The crypt was set into a far richer part of Canterlot Cemetery, as befitted its patron's place in the city. The family crest, a stallion holding a painting with a modest smile, was carved into the lintel of the marble door-frame. The night air stirred through the quiet place, and ruffled Steele's blond mane and tail. The old stallion's blue eyes regarded the decoration on the monument before them. His pale white fur was stained with browns and greens from the trek through the graveyard. It covered his muscled earth pony frame, which was only just contained by his golden armor, whose normal luster was dulled in the moonlight. Steele hefted the sack he carried on his shoulder, which clanked with the sound of metal on metal. Wearing a grim look, the earth pony studied the entrance before him, taking in the weathered stone and aged look of the monument. Nightblade had followed the lieutenant of the day guard to this place after the two forces' separate lines of investigation had both led the ponies to this point. The whole mystery around Dashing Daisy had caused the merger of both night and day guard forces into a joint task force. Nightblade was much younger than Steele. His gray body shivered in a way that had nothing to do with the chill, and his cat-like dark blue eyes were filled with apprehension. The pony stretched his leathery bat wings in a nervous way before he broke the silence.
"Are you sure this is the right place, Steele? I mean, it looks like no pony has been here for years."
Nightblade's voice trembled, betraying the unease the bat pony felt. Even if he was usually at home with darkness and moonlight, this place gave him the creeps. The white pony nodded slowly as the wind picked up once more.
"We're sure, Sergeant. All indications show that the pony we want is holed up in there."
Steele trotted forward closely, studying the ground before him while explaining his reasons.
"Look here. Signs that something heavy was dragged along the grass, and the lock has been disturbed."
Nightblade looked closer and saw the lieutenant was right. The ground, at first glance, had looked fresh. But then the bat pony saw how the grass was all bent one way, and the slight furrow formed by something heavy passing. A closer look at the padlock and chain which secured the crypt showed new scratch marks glinting in the moonlight. It was subtle, and Nightblade would have missed these signs if Steele hadn't pointed them out.
"Good eyes, sir, but this was locked from the outside. Maybe they just left the body inside, planning to come back later?"
It was true the door was closed, the chains pulled back in place, and the lock refastened. They all pointed to some pony locking the place up behind them.
"Fair point, Sergeant. But the witnesses claim that it was a unicorn behind the thefts. There are no tracks leading away from the crypt, and with their magic, they could pull everything shut behind them."
This left a number of more uncomfortable questions. Why would any pony lock themselves inside a crypt? Nightblade shuddered at the thought of being trapped with all those dead bodies.
"I don't pretend to understand the logic behind it, Sergeant Nightblade. Our job is to stop them and recover what they took,"
Steele declared with purpose in his eyes. Nightblade nodded and followed Steele as they trotted up the short set of stairs leading up to the crypt door. Steele dropped his sack and rummaged inside it, producing a small hammer and crowbar. Nightblade's ears flattened against his head as he realized what the earth pony was planning.
"Isn't that a bit disrespectful, sir? I mean, forcing entry into the tomb of a well-respected family."
Nightblade asked in an uncertain voice.
"What, more than stealing dead bodies and belongings? I don't think the family will mind that we have taken steps to prevent any further violation of their crypt. If it upsets you so much, we can always buy them a new lock. Keep your mind on the real priorities, Nightblade,"
Steele admonished, between strikes of his hammer that echoed around the graveyard. On the fifth strike, the abused lock finally gave way, and with a grunt Steel removed the chains and let them fall with a metallic clatter to the marble floor below. The massive door was now free, and Steel pushed it open with a squeal of metal on metal. Steel waved his hoof at the darkness with an amused smile.
"After you,"
was all he said. Nightblade swallowed the lump in his throat before taking a few hesitant steps into the darkness beyond. The lack of light was no hindrance for the Bat Pony. He could clearly make out the frescoes and nameplates that covered the walls. Knowing what to look for, he saw the disturbed dust on the ground that indicated something blocky had been pony-handled across the threshold and further into the crypt. The two guards made their way quietly along the now revealed rows of caskets that were placed in alcoves along the walls. These were some of the first ponies to be interred here, and Nightblade caught snatches of dates and names. The Conservation family line could be traced back to the founders of Canterlot, many hundreds of years ago, and ever since that time they had been keeping their dead here. A bright flash from behind Nightblade caused him to cover his eyes and hiss in pain. Steel had lit a torch, and it filled the tomb with a yellow flickering light, which was dazzling after the darkness.
"You could warn me the next time you're going to do that, sir,"
Nightblade complained as he shook his head and rubbed his hurting eyes. The Bat Pony blinked a few times and let his eyes grow accustomed to the light once again. When he looked at Steel, he saw the big pony had the decency to look apologetic.
"Sorry, I haven't got your night vision,"
Steel said, with a flat tone. Nightblade couldn't blame him. If they were going to work together, some compromises were going to have to be made. Better that Steel could see clearly, and Nightblade had to squint a bit. Nightblade nodded with a grimace and followed the trail of disturbed dust as it led further into the crypt. At least the light was behind him, and he could still make out the way ahead, with Steel following behind. It was a long way down, and twice Nightblade held up a hoof, indicating for Steel to stop, as he heard the sounds of movement ahead. Night's ears would swivel forward, trying to discover the source of the noise, but it was just rats, or some other small critter scurrying off into the darkness. Nightblade inwardly cursed again. Steel was a brave and good pony, but he was also very loud, his heavy hoof-falls disturbing the quiet, and making Nightblade's task much more difficult. The tunnels within the crypt had become less ornate as the crypt had expanded, less time and effort had been put into the internment of future generations. This became more evident as the guards pressed on. By the time the pair of stallions heard the sound of a pony's voice coming from ahead, the walls were rough stone. The voice was that of a stallion's by the sound of it, and though they couldn't make out what was being said, to their surprise it sounded jolly. It was very much at odds with the grim surroundings, and made Nightblade feel queasy inside. Steel looked troubled, too. This was obviously not what he had been expecting either. As the two ponies made their way forward, a dim light could be seen up ahead, and Nightblade motioned for Steel to douse the torch. The Earth Pony nodded, and the pair soon found themselves once again in darkness. The voice was becoming clearer as they approached its source.
"And then I said to him, 'My dear sir, that is not just an amateur painting, that's a genuine Craven.' Well, the colt didn't know what to say to that. I grinned smugly and left with my prize."
The sentence was all voiced in a high Canterlot manner, and followed by a brief chuckle from the speaking pony. Steel and Nightblade shared confused looks upon hearing this little speech, their mounting sense of dread turning to bemusement. The light was slipping out from under a door a few paces ahead, and Nightblade thought he caught the sound of a gramophone playing in the background. There were also the sounds of hoof falls and china scraping, which all added up to a pony was having a pleasant night in. That wasn't the only thing drifting from under the door. There was also the gut-wrenching smell that turned the stomach and caused both ponies to back away in disgust. Steel's eyes were watering, and Nightblade had gone a slightly green color. But there was no other option now. They had found the culprit, and they needed to do their duty. Dreading what they were going to find, Steel turned his back to the door and nodded to Nightblade. After a short pause, the powerful stallion's rear legs kicked out at the door, which lost its purchase on the surrounding door frame, and Nightblade quickly galloped inside. The room was richly decorated with finery and paintings. He was no art collector, but the gathered treasures within must have amounted to a mount of bits. The bad pony's eyes were instantly drawn to the shocked, well-dressed pony sitting on a chair at a small table. His expertly styled brown mane had a neat side parting to match his well-groomed coat of white fur. The stallion's eyes were wide with astonishment as the two guards forced their way into the well-lit room. Nightblade's vision inexorably drifted to the other ponies sitting at the table, and his stomach gave a heave. Nightblade had seen pictures of Dashing Daisy, and despite being dead and buried for nearly 3 weeks, he could still recognize the mare. His mind rebelled at the sight of the dead pony, who had been dressed up in a fine ball gown, with a veil covering her face. 2 skeletal ponies stood behind the table, one holding a tea-tray, and the other a bottle of wine in its hooves. The Bat Pony just stood there, unable to speak, as the only other living occupant of the room turned an angry shade of crimson. Steel gasped as he saw the scene within, and if he hadn't been white already, would have turned so.
"What is the meaning of this outrage?"
the well-dressed pony shouted once he had gathered his thoughts.
"This is a very private meeting, and I must demand you leave at once."
Both guards blinked in horror at the picture before them. There was food and candles and all the necessities of life stored in the small chamber. This mad pony planned to stay down here in the dark for a very long time, it seemed.
"Upright, gallant, please deal with these intruders. They are upsetting my guest,"
the insane stallion ordered. To the guards' dismay, the skeletal ponies began to shuffle around the table. No, not shuffle. They floated, with their hooves making a parody of walking. It took a couple of moments for Nightblade to realize that the unicorn sitting at the table was animating the dead bodies with his magic, like a puppeteer. Steel didn't waste a moment and dived in through the doorway and shoulder-barged the lead marionette, which flew apart in a clatter of bones. Nightblade, his eyes still stinging, turned to the unicorn and shouted,
"Stop this madness. You are under arrest in the name of Princess Celestia. Come quietly, and we will get you some help, good sir. You are not well."
Nightblade informed the still fuming unicorn, while Steel made short work of the other fleshless corpse, the skeletons having no real substance to them.
"I should have you both arrested for this intrusion. First, you barge in unannounced, and then proceed to assault my staff. I will be having words with your commanding officers."
The pony went on, still furious.
Knight, don't even try. He's way beyond reasoning with. Just subdue him, and then we can deal with the others.
Steel told the sergeant, who nodded again.
"Don't make me have to use force, sir,"
Nightblade asked in a pleading way. The unicorn's eye twitched, and something else in his mind snapped.
"Oh, I see. You want her for yourselves, huh? Well, you can't have her. I love her, and she loves me."
Before either pony could stop him, the unicorn levitated Daisy's body and held it close to him. Revulsion and pity warred in Nightblade's heart. He winced at the sense of loss before his eyes. With nothing else for it, Nightblade darted forward. The living pony was thin and sunken-eyed, and didn't put up much of a fight. He wept as Steel also rushed forward and pulled Daisy's body away from the unicorn, the soldier trying his best not to breathe deeply. The smell was overwhelming. The whole event was mercifully over in a few minutes. Nightblade's eyes lingered on the dead pony at his hooves as Steel Resolve fixed a magical suppression collar to the unicorn. The filly had been beautiful once, and though Nightblade didn't know her personally, he had heard she was a good mare who didn't deserve such a fate. As Steel cuffed the unicorn and led him away, the unicorn broke down totally. Nightblade looked about the room. All the missing items were there, by the looks of things, too, and therefore they could be returned to the ponies that missed them. The family could finally get some closure, too, although Nightblade doubted that the whole story of what had occurred would be known to the general public. Celestia didn't want to upset her ponies. Once again, Nightblade looked down at the dead mare. In the scuffle, her veil had come off, and under all the grime and other unnamed things covering her, the Bat Pony thought Daisy looked at peace. At least some pony will rest well tonight, he told himself. Nightblade knew the scene when he opened the door would linger for months to come. Shaking his head, Nightblade made to follow Steel, when a slight whispering breeze flowed through the room and blew out the candles. It was so subtle and quiet that Nightblade wasn't sure he had heard it at all. The words were so faint he wasn't sure they weren't just the wind. But Nightblade could have sworn he felt the soft impression of words, felt more than heard.
Thank you. And don't be too hard on Gentle Preserve. I missed him so much. I just wanted a little more time together.
Nightblade shivered as the moving air hissed around the dark room and lifted a simple picture showing a pair of ponies. In the total darkness that had fallen, the Bat Pony could see the image was of the unicorn being taken upstairs by Steel Resolve, along with Dashing Daisy. Both ponies looked so happy, and the photo was signed at the bottom.
To my dear Gentle, I'll love you for all time, and I'll never let you go.
Nightblade shivered, and just for the briefest of moments he thought he saw a cold blue glow under Daisy's closed eyes. The dead mare seemed whole and translucent, untouched by the ravages of decay, before the ghost light faded. The Bat Pony trembled before turning, galloping after Steel Resolve and the sobbing Gentle Preserve. When they finally left the crypt, Nightblade took in a huge breath of night air. The dark stallion declared to the world at large,
If I ever have to go into a grave again, it'll be too soon.